Dodge City, Kansas. November 12, 1876. The smell hits you first, raw hide, dried blood. The acrid tang of tanning chemicals mixing with the prairie wind that sweeps in from the southwest, carrying dust and the promise of winter. Stacked along the railroad siding of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, bales of buffalo hides rise 15 feet high, each bale compressed tight under a screw press, bound with iron wire, tagged with a shipper's mark and a destination. Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Chicago. A clerk in a wool coat and leather gloves moves down the line with a tally book, his pencil scratching numbers in neat columns. 400 hides in this lot, 600 in the next, 1,000 more waiting on flatbed wagons that rumble in from the south, their axles groaning under the weight. Behind him, a locomotive hisses steam, its iron flanks already half-loaded with the day's haul. The engineer checks his manifest. By sunset, this single train will carry 3,000 hides east toward the tanneries of Pennsylvania and New York, where they will be rendered into industrial belting, the thick leather straps that turn the wheels of America's factories, driving looms and stamping presses and rolling mills. The clerk does not look up. He has seen this before. He will see it again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. In the open yards beyond the depot, under canvas awnings stretched tight against wooden frames, skinners work in pairs, scraping the last bits of flesh and fat from green hides stretched on drying frames. The work is mechanical, repetitive, and it smells of death. Most of these men are young, their hands cracked and stained dark with blood and tanning solution, their wages tied to the piece rate, 25 cents per hide if the work is clean and the hide is prime, less if the scraping is sloppy or the hide is damaged. They do not speak much. There is nothing to say. The buffalo they are processing were shot 2 days ago, 40 miles to the southwest, part of a herd that had blackened a stretch of grassland 3 miles wide and visible from a low ridge 5 miles distant. Now the herd is gone, reduced to this, thousands of hides drying in the Kansas sun, a few tons of tongue and hump meat packed in barrels of brine for the restaurant trade back east, and the rest, the great bulk of bone and flesh, hundreds of tons of it, left to rot where it fell. The bones will be gathered later, in a year or 2 or 5, when the hide trade slows and the bone collectors move in with their wagons. They will pile the skeletons into great mounds at these same railroad sidings, and they will ship them east as well, to be ground into fertilizer or burned into bone char for the sugar refineries. Nothing is wasted that has value. Everything else is abandoned to the weather and the wolves. This is not an anomaly. This is not an outlier or an exceptional day. Across the Great Plains in the autumn of 1876, scenes like this repeat at a dozen railheads, Fort Griffin in the Texas Panhandle, where the hides are stacked in corrals near the Clear Fork of the Brazos River, North Platte in Nebraska, where the Union Pacific sidings are choked with wagons, Miles City in Montana Territory, still a year away from its peak, but already seeing the first shipments move downriver by steamboat. The industrial hunting of the American bison is at flood tide, a continental-scale harvest driven by the twin engines of railroad logistics and Eastern capital. It is efficient, relentless, and almost incomprehensibly vast in its scope and speed. In 5 years, the Great Southern Herd, the population that ranges across Kansas, the Indian Territory, and the Texas Plains, will be functionally extinct, reduced to scattered remnants too few and too dispersed to sustain commercial hunting. In another decade, the Northern Herd will follow the same trajectory. By the early years of the 20th century, fewer than 1,000 bison will remain alive on the entire North American continent, and most of those will be in captivity or under direct human management. This is the story of how that happened. It is a story built on receipts and shipping manifests, on the cold arithmetic of hide prices and railroad tariffs, on congressional debates and military dispatches, on the memories of hunters interviewed decades later and the field notes of naturalists who arrived just in time to count the last remnants and photograph the bone piles. It is not a story of myth or metaphor. It is a story of mechanisms, of how technology, markets, and policy converged in a single generation to erase one of the largest land mammal populations the world had ever seen. The numbers are staggering, almost abstract in their scale, but they are real. The bison were real. Their disappearance was real. And the systems that destroyed them were designed, funded, and executed by human hands, operating within legal and economic frameworks that not only permitted the slaughter but in many cases encouraged it. In the early decades of the 19th century, before the transcontinental railroads and the breech-loading rifle, before the hide market and the Industrial Revolution reached the Great Plains, the American bison moved across the continent in numbers that defy easy comprehension and resist precise calculation. Estimates vary widely, and they always will. No one conducted a scientific census in 1800, and the herds ranged across a geography so vast and remote that no single observer could see more than a fragment of the whole at any one time. European and American explorers traveling up the Missouri River in the early 1800s reported herds so large that they took days to pass a single point. Army surveyors mapping the Platte River Valley in the 1840s and 1850s described grasslands blackened with bison from horizon to horizon. Fur traders and mountain men, whose livelihood depended on intimate knowledge of animal populations, spoke of numbers beyond counting. But the weight of evidence, drawn from these fragmentary observations and later reconstructed through ecological modeling and historical demography, suggests a population in the range of 10 to 30 million animals in the early 19th century, with some historical sources and earlier estimates suggesting figures as high as 60 million. These are not precise counts. They are educated reconstructions, built on inference, extrapolation, and the application of modern ecological principles to historical data. But they converge on a single, undeniable conclusion. The bison population of North America in the early 1800s was enormous, perhaps the largest aggregation of large herbivores anywhere on the planet. For context, the African savanna elephant, often cited as the quintessential megafauna, numbers around 400,000 today. The bison population before the collapse was likely 50 to 100 times that size. The range of the bison in the early 19th century stretched from the Appalachian foothills in the east, where small populations persisted in western Pennsylvania and the mountains of present-day West Virginia, to the Rocky Mountains in the west, and from the boreal forests of northern Alberta and Saskatchewan down into the grasslands of northern Mexico. But the heart of bison country was the Great Plains, the vast rolling ocean of grass that spread between the Mississippi River and the Continental Divide, from the Canadian prairies south to Texas. Here, the bison were not merely abundant. They were the defining fact of the landscape, the organizing principle around which the entire ecology revolved. They shaped the grasslands through their grazing, their migrations, and their sheer biomass. They fertilized the soil with their dung, creating nutrient hotspots that supported diverse plant communities. They trampled firebreaks with their hooves, influencing the spread and intensity of prairie fires. They created wallows, shallow depressions where bulls rolled in mud and dust, that became seasonal wetlands, breeding habitat for amphibians and waterfowl. They served as prey for wolves and grizzly bears, supporting predator populations across the plains. They were, in the most literal and technical sense, a keystone species, an organism whose presence and behavior structure the entire ecosystem, and whose removal triggers cascading changes throughout the food web. For the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains, the Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Comanche, Kiowa, Pawnee, Blackfeet, Crow, Assiniboine, Plains Cree, and dozens of other nations, the bison was the foundation of life, the central pillar around which culture, economy, and spirituality were built. The animal provided meat, which was consumed fresh or dried into jerky or pounded with fat and berries into pemmican, a high-calorie food that could be stored for months. The hides were tanned and sewn into clothing, moccasins, teepee covers, bedding, and robes. The sinew was twisted into cordage for bowstrings and thread. The bones were carved into tools, scrapers, awls, knives, sled runners. The horns were boiled and shaped into spoons and cups. The hair was woven into rope. The bladder was cleaned and used as a water container. The dung, dry and fibrous, burned as fuel on the treeless plains. The hunt itself was not simply an economic activity. It was a social, spiritual, and political institution, woven into the fabric of plains cultures, governed by ritual and tradition, and central to the identity of the peoples who practiced it. The seasonal movements of the bison dictated the rhythms of human life across the plains. Villages relocated to follow the herds, dismantling and reassembling camps as the animals migrated north in summer and south in winter. Alliances and conflicts between nations were shaped, in part, by access to prime hunting grounds and the rich river valleys where bison concentrated during the rut. The abundance of the bison sustained human populations in the tens of thousands, perhaps as many as 250,000 people across the Great Plains by some estimates. In a region where agriculture was marginal or impossible due to low rainfall, short growing seasons, and the absence of reliable water sources. It was a way of life that had existed for centuries, and in the early 1800s, to those living it, it seemed as permanent and unchanging as the grasslands themselves. But even before the great collapse of the late 19th century, the bison were not untouched by market forces or immune to the pressures of commercial exploitation. From the 1820s onward, fur traders and hide merchants operated along the Missouri River and the edges of the southern plains, purchasing robes from native hunters and shipping them downriver to St. Louis and New Orleans, or overland to eastern markets. The trade was significant in volume, tens of thousands of robes per year by the 1840s, perhaps 100,000 or more in peak years, but it was limited by geography and logistics. Without railroads, the cost of overland transport was prohibitively high for bulk goods, and river transport was seasonal and slow. The market was therefore constrained to high-value products. Winter robes with thick, prime fur, suitable for sleigh blankets, carriage robes, and luxury coats sold to wealthy customers in eastern cities and Europe. The meat was generally unsaleable beyond local or regional consumption. It spoiled too quickly in warm weather, and the distances were too great. The bones were worthless because there was no economical way to transport them. And so the herds, though diminished in some areas, particularly along major river corridors and near trading posts, persisted at levels sufficient to sustain both native subsistence hunting and the commercial robe trade. The exploitation was real, but it was not yet industrial in scale or method. That changed, fundamentally and irrevocably, with the arrival of the railroads. The completion of the first transcontinental railroad in May 1869, linking the Union Pacific and Central Pacific lines at Promontory Summit in Utah Territory, was only the beginning. Through the 1870s, additional rail lines pushed west and south across the Great Plains. The Kansas Pacific reached Denver in 1870. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe reached Dodge City in 1872 and pushed on toward Santa Fe and beyond. The Northern Pacific began construction westward from Minnesota in the early 1870s, reaching Bismarck in Dakota Territory in 1873 and eventually crossing Montana to the Pacific. These railroads did not merely transport goods. They collapsed distance, transformed geography, and restructured the economics of resource extraction across the interior of the continent. A bison hide that would have been worth perhaps 25 or 50 cents in western Kansas in 1865, too far from any significant market to justify the cost of hauling it by wagon, could now be loaded onto a rail car and delivered to a tannery in Philadelphia or Newark for a freight cost of a few cents per pound. The economics of the bison hunt transformed overnight. Suddenly, it was profitable to kill bison not for their prime winter robes, but for their hides, any hide, winter or summer, bull or cow, thick or thin, prime or damaged. The market was no longer constrained by quality or season. It was constrained only by the ability to kill, skin, and transport. And that ability, as it turned out, was considerable. The introduction of the Sharps rifle in the 1850s and its widespread adoption by commercial hunters in the late 1860s and 1870s gave those hunters a weapon of unprecedented range, accuracy, and stopping power. The Sharps was a single-shot, breech-loading rifle, chambered in heavy calibers, typically 45-70 or 50-90, with an effective range of several hundred yards in the hands of a skilled marksman. The rifle used metallic cartridges, which were faster to load than the paper cartridges or loose powder and ball of muzzle-loading weapons, and the breech-loading mechanism allowed the shooter to reload without standing or exposing himself. A hunter working from a concealed position, prone on a low ridge or behind a rise in the terrain, with a good rest for the rifle and a supply of cartridges within easy reach, could kill dozens of animals from a single herd before the survivors panicked and fled. The technique, refined through practice, was to shoot the lead animals first or to target animals on the periphery so that the rest of the herd, confused and unable to identify the source of the threat, would mill about rather than stampede. In this way, a single hunter could kill 30, 50, even 100 bison in a few hours. The process was methodical, mechanical, and efficient. The hunt became a matter of industrial production, organized along principles of division of labor and cost minimization. One man with a rifle, one or two skinners with knives and whetstones, a wagon and a team of mules or oxen, and a buyer with a contract or a standing arrangement at a railhead. The economics scaled beautifully from the perspective of the hunters and the merchants. A skilled hunter might kill 50 bison in a day, 100 in a good week. At a price of $1.50 per hide, the approximate going rate at Dodge City in the mid-1870s, that was $75 in a day, real money at a time when a factory worker might earn $10 or $15 a week. The skinners earned less, typically paid by the hide at a rate of 25 cents or so, but even that was decent money for hard physical labor. The overhead was low, the cost of ammunition, the wear on equipment, the price of provisions. The profit margins were high, and the resource for the moment seemed inexhaustible. The market for bison hides was driven by a specific and urgent industrial need: belting. In the 1870s and 1880s, the factories of the eastern United States and industrial Europe were powered by steam engines, and that mechanical power was distributed through the factory floor by systems of leather belts running on pulleys and shafts, transferring rotational energy from a central engine to individual machines scattered across the building. Bison hide, thick and tough and available in large pieces, was ideal for this purpose. It was stronger and more durable than cowhide. It resisted stretching and cracking under load, and it could be cut into wide belts capable of transmitting significant horsepower. Tanneries in Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, and New Jersey paid premium prices for raw bison hides, which were processed through a series of chemical baths: lime to remove hair, tannins from oak or hemlock bark to cure the leather, and then cut, stitched, and finished into industrial belting. The demand was enormous, and it was not speculative or luxury-driven. It was structural, tied directly to the expansion of industrial manufacturing capacity in the post-Civil War economy. As long as factories needed belting, and as long as bison hide remained cheaper and more available than alternatives like multiple-ply cowhide or imported materials, the market for bison hides would remain strong. The federal government, for its part, did not intervene to halt or even meaningfully regulate the commercial slaughter. Congress debated protective legislation on multiple occasions in the early 1870s, and there were men in Washington, scientists, naturalists, and a handful of far-sighted politicians, who understood what was happening and warned of the consequences. In 1871, Representative Greenberry Lafayette Ford of Illinois introduced a bill to regulate the killing of bison on public lands, but it died in committee. In 1874, the push for protection gained momentum. On March 10, 1874, the House of Representatives passed a more ambitious buffalo protection bill, a measure that would have prohibited the killing of female bison and restricted hunting by non-native people on public lands in the Western Territories. The bill had support among conservationists, some Eastern politicians disturbed by reports of waste and destruction, and even a few Western representatives who worried about the long-term sustainability of the resource. But it faced fierce opposition from railroad interests, who saw the bison as a competitor for grazing land that could be used for cattle, from hide merchants and tannery owners who had invested capital in the trade and saw protective legislation as a threat to their profits, and from those in government and the military who saw the destruction of the bison as a useful, perhaps necessary, tool of federal Indian policy. The bill passed the House, but it stalled in the Senate and eventually reached the desk of President Ulysses S. Grant, who declined to sign it. The bill died by pocket veto, and no federal protection for the bison would be enacted for another 3 decades, by which time the animal was already on the brink of extinction. The role of the United States Army in the destruction of the bison is a matter of documented historical record, though it is often misunderstood or oversimplified in popular accounts. The Army did not, as a general rule, commission large-scale bison hunts or deploy soldiers as hunters in any systematic or organized fashion. There is no credible evidence of formal military campaigns explicitly aimed at exterminating the herds, no written orders from the War Department instructing officers to kill bison for strategic purposes. But the absence of direct orders does not mean the Army was neutral or uninvolved. On the contrary, the Army provided logistical support, armed escort, and physical protection to commercial hunters operating in contested territories, particularly in areas where conflict with Plains nations was ongoing or anticipated. Army posts served as supply depots for hunters, sources of ammunition and provisions. Army patrols escorted hunting parties through dangerous country, and senior officers, including some of the most prominent commanders of the Frontier Army, openly endorsed the destruction of the bison as a means of undermining the subsistence base of Plains nations resisting federal control and reservation policies. General Philip Sheridan, commander of the Division of the Missouri and one of the architects of federal military strategy on the Plains, is reported to have praised hide hunters in testimony before the Texas state legislature in 1875, arguing that they were doing more to solve the Indian problem than the Army could achieve through direct military action. General William Tecumseh Sherman, commanding general of the United States Army, expressed similar views in correspondence from the same period, framing the destruction of the bison as a strategic necessity that would force Plains peoples onto reservations and into dependence on federal rations. These were not private opinions expressed in confidence. They were public statements, made by men in positions of authority, reflecting a broader consensus within the military establishment that the elimination of the bison aligned with federal policy goals. The Army's posture was not one of active extermination in the sense of organized killing campaigns, but it was one of permissive tolerance, logistical support, and in some cases active encouragement. Federal policy and military strategy converged on a single outcome. The removal of the bison would facilitate the removal or submission of the peoples who depended on them. By the mid-1870s, the Great Southern Herd, the bison population that ranged across Kansas, the Indian Territory, and the Texas Panhandle, a region encompassing hundreds of thousands of square miles, was collapsing under the weight of commercial hunting. The best estimates, reconstructed from shipping records and contemporary accounts, suggest that the southern herd numbered in the millions as late as 1870. By 1875, it was reduced to hundreds of thousands. By 1878, it was functionally extinct, broken into scattered remnants too small and too dispersed to support viable commercial operations. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Fort Griffin, Texas, a military post on the Clear Fork of the Brazos River that became one of the major hide shipping centers in the mid-1870s, recorded shipments of over 200,000 hides in 1876 and 1877. By 1879, the shipments had dwindled to a few thousand. By 1880, the trade was over. Dodge City, Kansas, the largest and busiest railhead on the Southern Plains, saw its hide trade follow the same trajectory. In the peak years of 1872 through 1874, the rail sidings at Dodge City were choked with bales of hides waiting for transport. By 1878, the yards were empty. The market had consumed the resource on which it depended, and it had done so in less than a decade. The speed of the collapse was not an accident of nature or an unforeseen consequence of incremental change. It was the predictable result of applying industrial methods and capital investment to the exploitation of a finite resource in the absence of effective regulation. The hunters were not operating in ignorance. They knew the herds were shrinking. The evidence was visible to anyone paying attention. Smaller herds, longer distances between kills, lower prices as supply began to exceed immediate demand. But the economic incentives did not favor conservation. An individual hunter had no reason to leave bison alive for future seasons, because any animal he spared would simply be killed by another hunter. The resource was a commons, free for the taking, and the logic of the commons drove the system toward total depletion. By the time the herds were visibly collapsing, it was too late to reverse course. The infrastructure was in place, the capital was invested, and the momentum carried the industry forward until there was nothing left to kill. The northern herd lasted longer, but only because the railroads reached the northern plains later and the terrain was more difficult. The Northern Pacific Railway pushed west from Bismarck, Dakota Territory, in the late 1870s and early 1880s, reaching Miles City in Montana Territory in 1881 and continuing west toward the Rockies. The pattern that had played out on the southern plains repeated itself in the north with grim fidelity. Hunters followed the railroads, bringing with them the same rifles, the same techniques, and the same economic logic. The northern herd was perhaps smaller to begin with. Estimates are even more uncertain than those for the southern herd, based on fewer observations and sparser data. But it was substantial, numbering in the hundreds of thousands and possibly low millions as late as 1880. 5 years later, it was gone. In the autumn of 1886, William Temple Hornaday, a naturalist employed by the Smithsonian Institution and tasked with collecting specimens for the United States National Museum, traveled west to Montana Territory with the expectation of finding and documenting bison in their natural habitat. He found almost nothing. A handful of individuals, perhaps 24 in total, scattered across the breaks and badlands of the upper Missouri River, wary and nearly impossible to approach. The great herds, the numberless throngs that had darkened the plains for as long as human memory and oral tradition could recall, had vanished. Hornaday returned east shaken by what he had not seen, and he set to work on a comprehensive report documenting the collapse. The result, published in 1889 as The Extermination of the American Bison, was a landmark work of natural history and conservation advocacy, meticulous in its detail and unsparing in its conclusions. Hornaday estimated that fewer than 800 bison remained in all of North America at the time of his survey, a figure that included captive animals in zoos and private ranches, a small wild herd in Yellowstone National Park, a remnant population in northern Canada, and the scattered wild individuals he had encountered in Montana. His report was not a lament or an elegy. It was an autopsy, a forensic analysis of a catastrophe. He cataloged the mechanisms of destruction, the railroads that had made mass transport economically feasible, the hide market that had created demand, the rifles that had made killing efficient, the absence of legal protections that had allowed the slaughter to continue unchecked. He documented the scale of the killing through shipping records and interviews with hunters and hide buyers. He estimated that more than 4 million bison had been killed in the 4 years between 1872 and 1876 alone. He provided maps showing the historical range of the species and the areas where remnant populations still clung to existence. He included photographs of hide yards and bone piles, stark visual evidence of the scale of the destruction. And he named the guilty parties: the railroads, the hunters, the tanneries and hide merchants, the politicians who had blocked protective legislation in Congress, and the military authorities who had, at minimum, stood aside and allowed the slaughter to proceed. The report was a foundational document of American conservation, a call to action that helped galvanize public support for the protection of endangered species. But it arrived too late to save the animal it described from near-total extinction. It was not quite too late, however, to prevent the complete disappearance of the species. Yellowstone National Park, established in 1872 as the world's first national park, had harbored a small population of bison even as the herds outside the park were being systematically destroyed. The Yellowstone herd was partially protected by the park's remote location and difficult terrain, but it was not immune to poaching. Through the 1880s and 1890s, illegal hunters entered the park and killed bison for their heads, which were sold as trophies, and for their hides. By the early 1890s, the Yellowstone herd had been reduced to fewer than 50 animals, and by some accounts fewer than 2 dozen. The species was teetering on the edge of total extinction in the wild. The collapse was arrested only through direct and intensive intervention. In 1902, the federal government authorized funding for the construction of a captive breeding facility inside Yellowstone, the Lamar Buffalo Ranch, located in the Lamar Valley in the northern part of the park. Managers brought in 21 bison from private herds in Texas and Montana to supplement the remnant wild population, mixing genes and rebuilding numbers under controlled conditions. It was an act of desperation, an acknowledgement that natural recovery was no longer possible and that the survival of the species depended on human management. But it worked. The Yellowstone herd stabilized, then grew. By the 1920s, it numbered over 100 animals. By the 1930s, several hundred. By the 1950s, over 1,000. Today, the Yellowstone bison herd fluctuates seasonally between roughly 3,000 and 6,000 animals, making it the largest population of wild, free-roaming bison in the United States, and one of the few herds that still migrate and interact with predators in something resembling a natural ecological context. The recovery of the bison extended beyond Yellowstone, driven by a combination of government action, private philanthropy, and the efforts of early conservationists who recognized that the near extinction of the species was both a national tragedy and a policy failure. In 1905, a group of scientists, naturalists, wealthy sportsmen, and concerned citizens founded the American Bison Society, with the zoologist William Hornaday serving as its first president. The society's stated mission was to prevent the complete extinction of the American bison and to restore viable populations in protected areas across the West. It was one of the first organizations in the United States explicitly dedicated to wildlife conservation, and it operated at a time when the very concept of conservation as a public and governmental responsibility was still being debated and defined. The American Bison Society's first major project was the transfer of bison from the New York Zoological Park, the Bronx Zoo, to federal land in Oklahoma. In October 1907, 15 bison were loaded into specially built shipping crates and transported by rail from New York to the Wichita Mountains Forest Reserve, later designated the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge in southwestern Oklahoma. The animals were released into a fenced range of several thousand acres, protected from poaching and predation, and allowed to breed. The transfer was celebrated in newspapers across the country as a triumph of conservation, proof that the destruction of the bison could be not only halted but reversed. The Wichita herd thrived. Within a decade, it had grown large enough to supply animals for other reintroduction projects, and the refuge became a model for bison conservation efforts elsewhere. In 1913, 14 bison from the Bronx Zoo were sent to Wind Cave National Park in the Black Hills of South Dakota, establishing another foundation herd on public land. Additional refuges followed in the 1910s and 1920s. Fort Niobrara in Nebraska, the National Bison Range in Montana, reserves managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service. Each refuge was established with small founder populations, typically between 10 and 30 animals, carefully selected for genetic diversity and physical health, and each was managed with the tools of early 20th century wildlife biology, which emphasized careful record-keeping, controlled breeding, and active intervention to prevent disease and inbreeding. By the 1930s, the total North American bison population had climbed above 10,000 animals, and the immediate threat of extinction had passed. The species had been pulled back from the brink, but at a cost. The bison had been transformed from a wild animal into a managed one, its survival dependent on human oversight and intervention. But the story of the bison does not end with recovery, because the nature of that recovery is itself contested and incomplete. Today, there are approximately 500,000 bison in North America, a number that sounds reassuring and even triumphant until it is examined more closely. The vast majority of those animals, perhaps 90% or more, are privately owned, raised in commercial herds for meat production, and managed more like livestock than wildlife. Many of these commercial bison have been crossbred with cattle at some point in their lineage, either deliberately in the early 20th century when ranchers experimented with creating hybrid animals, or inadvertently through proximity and escapes. Genetic studies conducted since the 1990s have found cattle gene markers in many bison herds, both public and private, and the degree of genetic introgression varies widely by population. Some herds remain genetically pure or nearly so. Others carry significant cattle ancestry. The question of what exactly is being conserved, wild bison as they existed before the collapse, or a modified, semi-domesticated version adapted to commercial ranching, remains a matter of scientific and ethical debate. The conservation herds, the populations managed by public agencies and tribal nations with the explicit goal of preserving the species in something resembling its original ecological role, number only in the tens of thousands. Yellowstone's herd is the largest and most ecologically functional, but even it faces constraints. The park's boundaries are political and legal constructs, not ecological ones, and when bison migrate out of the park in winter, following ancient pathways in search of lower elevation forage, they come into conflict with ranchers and state wildlife agencies concerned about disease transmission, particularly brucellosis, a bacterial infection that can cause cattle to abort and that is endemic in the Yellowstone bison population. For decades, bison that left the park were either hazed back across the boundary by mounted riders and helicopters, or shot by state officials or hunters under special permits. Thousands of bison were killed in this way between the 1980s and the early 2000s, sacrificed to the politics of livestock management and property rights. Recent agreements have created limited tolerance zones outside the park where bison can winter on public land, but the conflict remains unresolved, and it encapsulates the ambiguities and contradictions of bison conservation in the modern era. The animals are protected, but only within boundaries. They are managed, but according to priorities that balance ecological goals with political and economic pressures. They are wild, but not free. The drivers of the bison's collapse were multiple, interconnected, and mutually reinforcing, and understanding them requires looking at the system as a whole rather than isolating individual factors. Technology was central. The Sharps rifle and other breech-loading firearms gave hunters the ability to kill far more animals in a given period than would have been possible with earlier weapons. But the rifle alone did not cause the collapse. Commercial hide hunting had existed before the Sharps, and native hunters using more primitive weapons had harvested bison for centuries without driving the population to extinction. What changed was not the weapon in isolation, but the weapon in combination with other factors. Transportation infrastructure was equally critical. The railroads collapsed the distance between the killing fields and the markets, turning bison hides from a frontier commodity with limited value into an industrial input with national and international demand. The cost of transport fell low enough that even marginal hides, damaged, out of season, scraped hastily, became worth shipping. The railroads also brought hunters and supplies into the plains, reducing the logistical barriers to entry and allowing more people to participate in the hunt. Without the railroads, the hide trade might have remained a regional business, constrained by the practical limits of wagon transport. With the railroads, it became an industry operating at continental scale. Markets provided the demand that made killing profitable. The industrial belting market was enormous, tied to the expansion of manufacturing capacity in the post-Civil War economy. Factories needed belting, and bison hide was the best available material. As long as that demand persisted, and as long as bison hide remained cheaper than alternatives, the killing would continue. The market was not speculative or luxury-driven. It was functional, serving real industrial needs. But it was also indifferent to sustainability. The tanneries and belt manufacturers had no direct stake in the long-term health of the bison population. They purchased hides at the best available price, and when the supply dried up, they shifted to cowhide and synthetic materials. The market rewarded short-term extraction, not long-term stewardship. Policy, or rather the absence of effective policy, permitted the collapse to happen. Congress debated protective legislation, and some members understood the stakes, but the bills failed. The reasons for failure were political and economic. Opposition from railroads and hide merchants, concern about interfering with free enterprise, and a broader ideological commitment to westward expansion and resource exploitation. There was also the military and strategic dimension. Federal Indian policy in the 1870s was aimed at confining Plains nations to reservations and breaking their resistance to federal control, and the destruction of the bison served that goal. Whether the policy was one of deliberate extermination or simply permissive neglect is a question of interpretation and depends on how one weighs the available evidence, but the effect was the same. The government had the authority and the capacity to regulate the hunt, and it chose not to do so. The Army's role, while often exaggerated in popular accounts that depict organized military campaigns to exterminate the bison, was nonetheless significant. The Army did not need to organize killing campaigns because the market was already doing the work. What the Army did was provide security and logistical support for commercial hunters, protect the rail.